Sego, I'm John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. This week I want to share a conversation I recently had with a person I've come to know through my involvement in the mascot battle at my old high school in Cambridge, New York. But before we get into that, I need to give you some updates on the mascot battle in Cambridge. Recently, on episode 546 of this show, I covered the week leading up to the school board's successful passing of a resolution to retire their offensive race-based mascot. That episode was called That One Week in Cambridge. And in it, we featured a conversation with a local Cambridge, New York activist and talked about the outside pressures applied on the school board to finally make the right decision. Well, unfortunately, 1 week after the Cambridge Central School Board resolution was to become effective, new members were sworn in that shifted the balance of the school board in favor of keeping their offensive mascot, and they immediately rescinded the resolution of the previous board and passed a new resolution to keep their offensive name and merely review the offensive mascot and logo. Although this new school board has decided to take a closer look at the mascot, make no mistake about it, they are determined to keep the offensive name and some form of Native imagery moving forward. As I pushed for my old high school to drop its Native mascot, myself and others provided the school board with a great deal of information that should have been enough to leave no doubt about the inappropriateness of Native mascots. Included in that information were resolutions, official statements, and press releases from Native organizations, nations, and reports from professional organizations on the psychological damage that Native mascots inflict not only on Native people, but on other people of color as well. The folks in Cambridge, in spite of calling themselves Indians for 80 years, have no knowledge of Native history, beyond some sketchy local folklore and the general acknowledgement that all lands claimed by towns, states, and the U.S. in general were, of course, Native lands first. One of the rumors now spreading through the small community is that the newly sworn-in school board members will push to put a stronger emphasis on what some residents believe to be Mohican history for their new mascot. Some of this sketchy and poorly researched local lore involves a story that promotes the idea of a sacred Mohican owl as a supposedly significant cultural or even spiritual image representing the Native peoples originally from the land that Cambridge now occupies. To address claims by the small community of white people that the area is so rich with Native history and that this quote-unquote respect for that history is part of the justification for their continued use of an offensive school mascot, I tried to put an emphasis on statements from the actual Native people who were indeed indigenous to that region. As you all know, I'm Mohawk, or Gunyagahaga. This region was an area that my ancestors once called home. But with a history that goes much further back than any settler can seem to comprehend, the area would see Mohican, Huron, and several other Native peoples living in the area at various times through our history. But it's pretty much acknowledged that the area was predominantly occupied by Mohawks and Mohicans. So I and others made sure we had statements or resolutions from Mohawks, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mohicans. This is where I first learned of and was introduced to Heather Bruegl. Heather is a cultural affairs director for the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation. She is Oneida and Mohican and lives and works on the territory of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation in what is now known as Wisconsin. Heather provided both the official Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation resolution condemning any and all use of Native mascots, as well as a specific statement to the Cambridge School Board on the matter, making the Mohican stance clear. No more Native mascots. With that, let me introduce Heather Bruegl. I want to start our conversation by first mentioning that North Haven, Connecticut, last night voted unanimously to retire their Indians mascot and logo. I got a text message from one of the residents there who thanked me for my work because they've been watching what's been happening in Cambridge. And I've got a hashtag. I say, don't be like Cambridge. Because they are actually standing as the example of what not to be. I mean, you have a school that literally retired the mascot, and a week after that came into effect, they rescinded that order, and and have every intention of bringing it back. There's such an effort there in Cambridge to come up with some reason to keep their name, the Indians. They are really trying to do this, this almost frantic attempt to come up with Native history that they are completely oblivious to. So there is, they really don't know who the Native people were that were indigenous to that area. And as you and I discussed, that has changed over time. It was Mohican territory, it was Mohawk territory, it was Huron territory. But what's happening now, the resolution that Cambridge passed was that they would keep the name, but they would form a committee and they would look into the appropriateness of the logo that they currently have, which is like clip art. It's the same logo that 20 or 30 other schools up and down the East Coast have used. They just put a little color.
Yeah.
Actually, and the crazy part with Cambridge's logo is that it's white-faced. It's a white logo with one orange feather. So they're going to determine the appropriateness of this. And one of the threads that is being pulled real hard in Cambridge is there's a story that somebody has recounted, and I don't even know where it comes from, but that there was once a chief in that area a Mohican chief that was called Chief Owl. I mean, there's a river there called the Owl Kill, which is, the kill is part of a Dutch language for river.
Yeah.
And the area does have a relatively healthy population of owls in the area. But what some of these folks are saying, that we're going to call ourselves the Indians, but we're going to use the sacred Mohican owl as our logo and our mascot. The obvious question is, why not call yourself owls, right? I mean,
right. Like, just be an owl. Like, I don't
be the
get
Cambridge
it.
Owls.
Am I
right?
missing something?
But see, this is an attempt, and now and again, I'm glad I'm talking to you because they're trying to incorporate this as some sacred creature, part of creation that was that has a unique and meaningful and spiritual presence with the Mohican. So they're trying to manipulate and reassert your culture with this owl image, and I mean it's. Again, when we talk about erasure, these guys are trying to create a narrative that you, as the cultural affairs director, you can't even substantiate the story that they're trying to tell.
Right. And not to mention, if they're portraying it as some sacred, spiritual, ceremonial thing, that makes it even worse.
More inappropriate. Exactly.
It makes it completely inappropriate because it's you don't do that. I mean, as Indigenous people, we understand ceremony, we understand the sacredness of certain objects. We don't use them as mascots or advertising or anything like that. So that idea, that concept that they're trying to work with, that they're just making up, just makes you sound even more awful.
Whatever the relationship is that we have with various animals that were indigenous to the area that we live, then look, we do use animals as part of our stories, our storytelling. Our clans are oftentimes fashioned in the image of an animal of some sort. I mean, as a Mohawk, we have bear, wolf, and turtle. We do use other animals like the eagle as a part of our story with the formation of the Haudenosaunee and the Guyana-Goa, our great law of peace. And we talk about eagle sitting on top to be vigilant and ever viewing any calamity or danger that could come our way. So we have these images. But the idea of using an eagle or an owl or an animal is one thing. But to make it into a native thing that they know nothing about is problematic. And that's, again, white people grabbing onto something that they know very little about and trying to make something more significant into it. And and it's frustrating. And you're right. It's degrading because it doesn't take into consideration. Nobody contacted any historian that has any native background to talk about this. I mean, Bill Starner's book, which I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with, that talked about
Mhm.
from homelands to new lands, the story of the Mohicans. I recommended that some of the folks read that, so at least they'd have that view. Not that that's the singular and all knowing view of at least the Mohican experience, but it would give them more than what they know. But they're going to hang on some anecdotal story about either a chief owl or and of course that wouldn't have even been the words that we would have used. I had somebody from Cambridge ask me, so why can't we use an animal but we'll use the native word for that animal? I says, well, why use the native word? And they said, we have a lot of eagles here. What she asked me, what's the Mohawk word for eagle? I said, look, I'll tell you what the Mohawk word for eagle is, but when you hear it, you're going to realize that it's probably not appropriate anyway. It doesn't roll off your tongue the way it rolls off of ours. I mean, our word for eagle is one of the words is agwaks. Well, who's going to want to call themselves the Cambridge agwaks? Even putting the word Cambridge next to a native name doesn't necessarily flow. And so whether they want to come up with the Mohican word for owl and try to incorporate that, it's just all inappropriate.
And why does it have to revolve around indigenous anything? Do you know what I mean? Like, why can't you just refer to yourself as the owls or the eagles and not have any indigenous connotation attached to it at all? What is why is there this need for this school district to have some indigenous attachment to it when I can guarantee you're probably not even teaching the indigenous history in your school?
Well, and that's just it. There's a fetishizing of native imagery, and of course,
Right.
that connects to all kinds of native problems. Problems that we have. Including missing and murdered Indigenous women. I spoke of this at the board
Absolutely.
meeting, and I said, look, if you're fetishizing Native people, you're also fetishizing Native women, and that contributes to the problems that we have. And I had people heckling in the back, like, "Well, it's got nothing to do with it." I mean, there's literally people out in Cambridge who are suggesting that this whole mascot thing was started by the Me Too movement. That somehow I've been funded by George Soros to go to go out to Cambridge to try to strip them to try to steal their identity from them. It is that absurd. And of course,
I can't even comment on that.
well, and
It's just too
this
absurd.
this conversation about critical race theory, which is obviously something that's got to concern you a little bit, because what's
Yeah.
happening is obviously critical race theory is an academic analysis of law being impacted by racism. I mean, that's what it is. And it isn't taught in the high school, and it certainly isn't taught in the grade school. There's a few colleges that offered some in-depth study on critical race theory, because it's pretty clear that racism is systemic, and that the embeddedness of racism, I mean, obviously school mascots is a perfect example of it. But now we've heard some of these QAnon folks and these Proud Boy folks are really trying to make a push, even at the school board level, to get right-wing folks into school boards that will condemn critical race theory generally. And then what happens is any analysis of history that might make white people uncomfortable gets labeled as critical race. There's like 17 states that are so far that have passed laws forbidding schools from teaching critical race theory. Now, the problem is, well, for one thing, nobody's teaching critical race theory in these schools. But if they start using their broader definition of critical race theory, they'll fire teachers, tenured or not. They'll fire teachers because they are violating a state law. And this is the direction that we're going in. And so when I hear some of these schools like Cambridge, and so many others that are saying, well, we're going to incorporate more Native studies in our curriculum, not to solve the mascot issue, but to prolong the mascot issue. This is going to be our justification for keeping it. Now we're going to teach more about it. Well, why didn't you do it for the last 80 years? So how do you reconcile this push by the right against critical race theory and teaching any history that might make white people uncomfortable with this new desire to teach Native history to justify your mascots. And the simple answer is they're going to teach things like corn and canoes and Native people enlisting in the armed forces. They'll even play that game where they'll highlight which Native territories or peoples fought on the side of the Americans in like the Revolutionary War, and never finish the story, because obviously this is part of the Stockbridge and the Oneida story. Yes, they
Yes.
fought on side of the Americans. And how did that work out for you?
Well, considering that the seat of government for Mohican Nation is now in Wisconsin.
There you go. That's my point.
I mean, I think those who are against, opposed, afraid of critical race theory are afraid of the truth. They're afraid of having to confront something about the nation that they love. They look at it as unpatriotic, where I look at it as the most patriotic thing you can do is to question and understand that the nation that you live in is flawed, and it was flawed from the start. And it's okay. We don't have to be perfect. We are not that city upon a hill, as was written by the Pilgrims when they first came over. We're not that. This country has made mistakes, founded, on genocide, built on the backs of the enslaved. It's not saying white people are wrong or bad. It's just saying that the racism and discrimination that was at the start is so systematic and built into our institutions that it is literally as American as apple pie.
In fact, if we bring up race and racism, then that is treated as un-American, and that's what we're confronted with now. Look, as Native people, we still stand at a very much at a crossroads in our own identity. When they do teach about Native history, they teach us as a timestamp that ended with colonization. I mean, when I was a kid, they used to teach us there was Indians, discovery, colonization, revolution. Those are the first four eras of American history. And it's, wait, so we ended when a ship showed up here? I mean, and that's exactly the way it's taught. I mean, there's a little bit of interaction, between natives, and that gets mischaracterized. I think one of the biggest problems we have is the fact that so many false narratives are told about U.S. Native history or Canadian Native history that our own people are confused by it. Not to mention, obviously, the vast majority of white people.
Right, and I think that's where critical race theory is a good thing. It is talking about the truth, talking about what actually happened, talking about what really went down in the Caribbean in 1492 when Columbus landed, what really happened after Thanksgiving and the Pequot Wars, what really happened. People say it's Civil War is a states' rights issue. Yeah, it was about the states' rights to own people. So it's really talking about that truth. It's not saying, that you should feel bad for the race you are or you were born, or you should feel bad for being an American. It's not saying any of that.
But
What
you
it
shouldn't
is
have a
saying,
privilege. You shouldn't have privilege
exactly,
because of the color of your skin.
right. You should understand the why you have a step up, why there is that inequality in the United States. It's understanding that history, and it's also understanding that those founders of the United States were all very flawed people. And I think one of the most perfect examples to look at is the four presidents that are on Mount Rushmore.
Sure.
Right? George Washington, who was a slave owner who forced out my ancestors after they fought in the Revolution under him. Thomas Jefferson, who created the Louisiana Purchase, who was also a slave owner, which opens the door to the 1830 removal. Lincoln, again, who signs the death warrant for the 38 Dakota after the Dakota Uprising. And then Teddy Roosevelt, who says the only good Indian is a dead Indian.
Yeah.
So it's understanding the flaws and learning from them.
But the reason for knowing this stuff is not just so we can say, okay, you owe us something now, but you need to understand that the circumstances that we find ourselves in, and I say the same thing, with any oppressed people, black people, for instance. You can't sit there and judge black people for the lives that they've been trying to carve out in not only a post-slavery America, but a post race. I mean, look, the whole the whole era of racism and lynchings, and I mean, well after the Civil War. I mean, look, the Tulsa riot took place in the after the turn of the century. So how do we reconcile any of this stuff if we can't even acknowledge that yes, there are people that have been treated very, very badly, and when we talk about things like the residential schools, we also have to tie that to the foster care system and the child protective services, and so much that has continued to rip children away from out of Native homes in spite of the Indian Child Welfare Act. We know, look, when Maine did their Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it was over foster care. It wasn't over residential schools. It was over Native kids that were being abused in the foster care system.
Yeah. How do we reconcile that? We can't even have conversations about it. You can't have a really amazing project like the 1619 project come out without someone on the right having to retaliate with the 1776 project. Like, that's a load of crap, in my opinion. And to lash out against these initiatives that are about truth telling is it's very scary.
Well, and again, one of the things that I have to remind people is not just that Thomas Jefferson referred to the Native people as merciless Indian savages in that document from 1776, but that one of the main reasons for the fight for independence from Great Britain was the fact that the colonists wanted to grab more native land, and King George was saying, "No, you need to put the brakes on that. We're going to try to subjugate Native people by bringing them into our society." That's what King George said. Now, look, I'm not giving him a pass because, look, we were double dealt with on every turn. But the colonists were pissed that they couldn't just advance into Native territories. And, their whole argument about taxation without representation, the myth is that Great Britain was grabbing all of this tax revenue to bolster their coffers in England. The reality is most of the taxation that was happening amongst the colonies was to pay for frontier security, and this British military, wasn't so much fighting off native advancements, but it was fighting off colonial advancements into native territories. And again, that's not talked about, but if you read carefully the language in the Declaration of Independence, you realize how much of it was associated with the colonists wanting to advance their, what they called the frontier, which is essentially a euphemism for wanting to steal more native lands.
Right. And not to mention, when you also hear those words, all men are created equal, you have to really think about who were they actually talking about, because it wasn't you and it wasn't me.
It was
And
white men.
it wasn't 90% of the colonists.
Yeah.
It was the aristocracy.
Exactly. And when I talk about the language in the Declaration of Independence, if that stood alone, that'd be one thing. But then when you realize what those founding fathers actually did, I mean, Thomas Jefferson, you're right, he paved the way for the Removal Act. That's what the whole justification was for the Louisiana Purchase. George Washington, in the Sullivan campaign, basically called for terrorism against the Senecas and allies. He said, let them know the terror of their chastisement. He talked about this notion of intergenerational trauma that they could inflict upon Native people, so they would never rise up again. So this is the level of ruthlessness that these glorified founding fathers are are really responsible for. Yeah, we can talk about people being flawed, and I'm not suggesting that everybody should always be judged by the worst thing they did in their life. But you can't check that off the list. I mean, you can't just knock that off and say, yeah, sure, Thomas Jefferson was having sex with his slaves, having children with his slaves, who then became slaves. But other than that, he was a good guy. I mean, we how do you have that conversation?
Right. And it's funny, bringing up the concept of Jefferson. When I was in college, I actually wrote my dissertation on him because I have a very weird and problematic obsession with him, and I don't know why. I can't put my finger on it, but it, you know, when people do talk about his relationship with Sally Hemings, and they talk about it being, it could have possibly been a love relationship or a consensual relationship, and I'm like, it wasn't consensual.
If you're a
And
slave,
the
nothing you
reason,
do is consensual.
exactly, there was a power dynamic there that is unfair in her favor. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like, it is unfair towards her.
yeah.
And nobody talks about her or her feelings or how she might have felt in that situation. It always comes off on Jefferson's side because history is written by the victors.
Well, the interesting thing is that there's been a recent study into Jefferson as a business person, and this analysis in his slaveholding was that he was meticulous in his record keeping. He knew exactly how much he needed to feed his slaves, or how little he could feed them before their work would drop off. I mean, his accounting practices, what made him among the most efficient and well documented slaveholders in all the colonies. And so when you look at that, and when you find the areas of well kept buildings that he had for chaining up his slaves, including the little kid handcuffs that they found in some of his places, it is really, there's no way that you can spin that to make it go away and say, but he other than that he was completely moral and ethical. I mean,
Exactly. If one doesn't fit the other, there is definite wrongs that were happening that need to be understood. The idea of a good slave master does not exist.
as a Mohawk, knowing that the town that I went to school in, which was a part of some of my ancestral homelands, that I'm essentially not welcome there just because of the mascot issue, that knowing that somebody like yourself who is again part Mohican, and works for the Mohican Nation, would not be welcome in a place like that by the people, not by the land. I mean, the land is beautiful. I mean, it is really incredible. But then you rapidly get confronted and get slapped in the face um, by some of the very people who, on one hand, are claiming that they're honoring Native people with their high school mascot, but at the same time, absolutely despising who we are because we conflict with what they want to do. Look, Cambridge did during some of this battle over this mascot. The school board hired a company to come in and do healing circles. Now, the first bunch of them were done via Zoom, and it was supposed to be everybody could tell how they speak to the harm that they felt, not by the mascots, but by the mascot debate, which seemed to me inappropriate. But at some point, when this thing came to the end of this company's work there, they decided that COVID had waned enough that they could do some in-person healing circles, and they turned into absolute debacles because that's when the pro mascot people really came out to participate, and they didn't come out to participate in healing. They came out to participate in threats and violence and bullying. And not only did they really beat up on one of the school board members in particular, but one of the moderators from this company that was doing it was Oneida from Wisconsin, and he was working for this company, and he was verbally assaulted by these. So I mean, just the idea that being a Native person in that environment right now today is, in spite of how we feel about the place, the people have really turned it into something not very welcoming.
Right. And as somebody who lives in a border town, I can definitely relate to uh, that negativity, and just nastiness that can be directed towards you.
Well, and the reality is, up until recently, 90% of these schools that had Native mascots were all using the standard Hollywood full headdress Plains Indian um, logo for who they were. Um, Back 20 years ago, there became a little more sensitivity about using imagery that was perhaps a little bit more accurate to the region. But that doesn't, I've got good friends down in Pennsylvania. One of my dear friends is fighting a school called Neshaminy, and they made a lot of news over the years because their school newspaper refused. They called themselves the Redskins, and of course that's one of the worst possible names. So they're the Neshaminy Redskins, and their school newspaper refused to print the word, and it turned into a bit of a national story. In fact, the Native American Journalists Association, NAJA, actually gave special recognition to this newspaper. It's called the Playwikian, that was standing up against racism, and that school is fighting it all the way. They're digging in just like Cambridge is, and they have the full Plains Indian headdress. They aren't acknowledging the Lenape or any of the Native people who really would have been indigenous to that area. They just grab whatever image they want and they claim it for themselves. And you mentioned this earlier when you talked about the heritage claim, because it's like they take this and they take it and they make it theirs, and they will actually fight us over it and say, well, you're not who we're talking about. I mean, I literally had this one group that they call Naga, where they were trying to suggest that when they are honoring Native people with these images, they aren't talking about us. They're talking about a people who don't exist anymore. So it's almost like they're like, not only do they lock in with this timestamp an image of Native people who no longer exist, but they're actually saying that's who they are representing. They aren't representing us. And of course that's just flat out willful ignorance. It's not just ignorance, it's willful ignorance.
Yeah, like how do you even how like I can't even formulate an intelligent response to that, because there is already a huge issue with erasure. Prior to the pandemic, the last in-person lecture I gave was either in January or February of 2020. So just last year, before COVID-19 really, shut the world down. And I had someone come up to me after that lecture, and full honesty on their part, tell me that they didn't know that Indigenous people still existed.
There is a prevailing belief among Americans, and even on the Canadian side as well, that we don't exist, or what we do exist as is this. One of the reasons I have a problem with the word Indigenous, its actual definition is one thing, but the way it is used in international realms, I guess, is that an Indigenous person is considered a person who is a descendant of the people who lived in a place before colonization. That we're not actually those people, that we are merely the descendants. I have a problem with that. Look, I'll acknowledge that I have ancestors and I'm a descendant of those ancestors, but I am those same people. I'm a descendant of those individuals, but I am those same people. One of the things that I also bring up often when I'm talking about the mascot issue is, are you familiar with L. Frank Baum and some of his writings?
Yes.
L. Frank Baum wrote The Wonderful Wizard of
Yeah.
Oz, but he was also the newspaper editor of the Pioneer
Yes.
in Aberdeen, Dakota Territory, and he wrote two editorials that are known as the genocide editorials, where he calls for our extermination. And he says, why not extermination? Their glory has fled, their manhood has been effaced. Better they die than live the miserable wretches that they are. And then he goes on to say that we would be remembered in later days as the grand kings of the forest and the plain. And he actually lays the foundation to view Native people with almost this backhanded kind of compliment in a way that yes, they were this noble, these noble beings, these grand kings of the forest and plain, but they aren't anymore. And it's better that we die off than destroy the legacy that Americans are going to want to keep of Native people, and that they will later praise those people. In fact, not only will they praise it, they'll call their school mascot by those names. So when I read L. Frank Baum, and if you haven't read it recently, take another look at it, because when you read it, you realize this is the mentality that goes with not only erasure by omission, but by intentionally erasing a people so you can recreate that image for yourself to bolster your own ego. And essentially that's what the mascot issue is.
Yeah, we're still here. We haven't gone anywhere. We still have beautiful, thriving communities with rich histories. And it's with pasts that are older than colonization
Older than
itself.
America, as they
John
say.
Trudell, yeah, John Trudell once said that we aren't just the Native Americans, we are the human beings because we are older than,
Yeah.
we have a history that is longer than. I just really, and I try really hard to like put myself, to try to understand the other side when it comes to this mascot issue or things like that. And I just can't because I don't get it, especially when you know all of the facts, when you read the studies, when you hear what the communities have to say, and you just turn a blind eye. I cannot understand that.
Well, and of course, the one challenge that we always face, and this is one of the challenges that I faced in Cambridge, is invariably they're going to find some person who either claims to be Native or has some Native ancestry that is in full on favor of these mascots. And why? Because they are made to feel special in a community of white people because they represent the permission. So not only do you get an organization like NAGA that claims to be guardians of Native culture, advocating any mascot. It doesn't matter what derogatory name is used. Redskin, savage, it doesn't matter. They will fight for any school to maintain this stuff. And then they create this stupid phrase, educate, not eradicate. And when we're calling for the removal of mascots, we're not talking about eradicating anything. We're saying stop the erasure that the mascots represent. But when we get confronted with people who have sometimes legitimate Native ancestry, but are so removed from their own nations, from their own people, from their own community. Why? Because they've chosen a different path. Look, we all make tough choices in our lives, and we don't all find that path that really solidifies our identity. And I don't begrudge somebody who says, okay, I'm going to make a life for myself. I'm no longer going to be connected to my culture. Look, that's a choice. And I understand that. Being Native isn't easy. I mean, for all of the great things you can say about our territories, we also know we're still plagued with so many of the of the damage from the past as well. So when I hear somebody that says, no, I'm going to live amongst white people and I'm going to live white passing and all that other stuff, I get it. I don't have as much a problem with that as I do when that same individual or individuals who have chosen that life now stand up and say, well, I can speak for all Native people and mascots are fine.
Right. Yeah, you can't. I feel like as Native people, we already are straddling two different worlds. Like we're trying to stay true to who we are as Native people while also trying to survive in a very colonized world.
Very
So it's
capitalistic
like we're
society. Yep.
absolutely, so we are already straddling both sides of the fence and trying to do right by our ancestors and by our families. And so when you have those people for whatever reason, and I'm never one to question somebody's ancestry or their family history, you but you can't come in and say that you speak for all of us. I mean, as a historian and a lecturer, if I'm getting up and I'm lecturing on the Dakota Uprising, I make it a point to say, I do not speak for the Dakota people. I'm just here to tell you the history of something. If you want to know Dakota feelings, you need to talk to a Dakota person,
Well,
like
and that's
not
why we
me.
solicited the view and the opinion and the resolutions out of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation
Mhm.
and Mohawks and the Haudenosaunee. That's why we did that, because I didn't want to go there and say my voice is more important than your local Native family's voice. I'm saying that my voice is shared by all of these, and that is the difference. And I agree with you. If somebody tells me that their grandmother was a Cherokee princess, I don't immediately confront that, but I also have to take it with a grain of salt. And
Exactly,
where I come
exactly.
back to, anytime somebody tells me that they're part Native and get into the blood quantum thing or whatever, I say, but who's your family? Or
Yeah,
what community are you a part of? And that's not an interrogation. That's the way I'm going to get to know this person. And if you
right,
don't have any of that, then I say, oh, okay, so you just have Native ancestry. You don't really have a cultural connection. And when you
right.
ask somebody that, that's when they start to struggle a little bit, especially if they were trying to use their ancestry as some sort of entitlement to speak in an area that they don't really know much about.
Right, and it gets harder when you are a nation that's been removed from your homelands and like so far removed that you are now 1,000 miles away and you've got people in your homelands speaking on things that they have nothing to do with, and that that is a whole other conversation. But it's definitely hard, especially when you're trying to you know speak on behalf of your nation, because you have the backing of your nation and you've got people out there who think that they know their history better than you, and it gets into some sticky situations.
Well, and you mentioned about that balance of the two worlds. You're Oneida, and so the Goswantha, or the Deohade, which is also called the Turo Wampum, is something that you're a part of.
Yeah.
And the Turo Wampum is visualized by a wampum belt that is basically a white wampum belt with two um, rows of purple wampum. And the whole idea is that it represents two distinct peoples, not just white people and Native people. I mean, in fact, I'm sure at some point between the Mohicans and the Mohawks, we had shared this concept of the Turo, which we are distinct people. We both have paths across our mother here, and we need to mutually respect each other. And when white people came, they didn't have a path here. So we changed the analogy a little bit. And so we talked about the ship and the canoe. So we talked about being on the same river of life, but in very distinct vessels. And while we're going to share some of the same experiences because we're passing on that same river, we won't try to steer each other's canoe. And we won't try to straddle each other's vessel in the water. I think the life that we lead today is challenging because the river is what's changed in many ways, because we are all confronted with different ways of sustaining ourselves and
Hmm.
teaching each other. And the language isn't something that we went into their vessel to grab. It was kind of imposed. They violated Turo. And so now we're figuring out, how do we maintain ourselves in our own vessel along that river of life without totally jumping into theirs or totally being overrun by theirs. And that's the life that we. So when you talk about that balance, part of that balance is understanding. Yes, we are a distinct people, and we need to know when, where, and how we can assert that distinction, because it's, we can't take on every battle. We have to sometimes choose our battles wisely. The one thing I will say about the mascot issue, it does matter because we are changing what generations of white children are going to be learning in their schools, and it could impact our future as we do away with some of that bias that has been taught in this systemic racist system.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a battle that is both easy and difficult at the same time. Easy because when you can change that mind, it happens really fast and it happens in good faith. Difficult because, as in the issue of Cambridge, you hit a brick wall. And it's, one that I think if we keep working on and keep bringing awareness to, one where we could hopefully soon eradicate the use of, you know, native imagery as mascots and instead of, using mascots as a way to quote honor, native history and heritage, maybe we actually have that taught in schools instead. And, the idea of telling the truth in our history is not such a foreign concept.
Well, and I have all the confidence in the world that we will move most of these schools, if not all of these schools, in a relatively short time frame. If you look at the number of schools that have dropped their native mascots, there are more that dropped them in the last 2 years than have in the last 10 years. So look, we're winning this battle, and I think that even when we run into these brick walls in places like Neshaminy High School or in Cambridge, Neshaminy, Pennsylvania, or Cambridge, New York, as much as I was never a big fan of state mandates against this, I've come to the realization that there are such deeply ingrained pockets of racism across the United States and Canada that if there aren't some sort of mandates that are imposed from outside of a community, then there are some communities that will never come to their senses and do the right thing. So it probably will be imposed on them at some point. I think 5 or 6 states already have passed laws prohibiting native mascots, and I know New York has one on the books. I don't know has the state of Wisconsin addressed this at the state level yet?
No.
Okay. Well, and I
No,
know
hopefully soon.
I know I've been dealing with a few schools out in that area, but mostly in Michigan and I think Illinois. I've got I think Mahuka is it Mahuka High School or Manuka High School. I mean, is one of those schools that's really fighting it, and that they're in the Midwest there. So
Yeah, I would hope that with Wisconsin being home to 11 federally recognized tribes would, back the nations and hopefully get something on the books soon.
yeah, yeah. Well, and in a perfect world, people would realize the wrong of it and would do the right thing. But unfortunately,
That is true.
that it doesn't always happen that way. Heather, let me shift gears a little bit. Look, I'm actually speaking to you. I live on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation, so I live out near Buffalo, I guess is the best way to describe it. But I am Mohawk. I'm Gunyagahaga. My family is from Ganawage. My wife is Oneida, and we lived in Oneida territory for a while on the 32 acres near Stockbridge and Oneida. That's why I know the area. But I'm not living in my quote unquote ancestral lands today. I mean, my father was a high steel worker. So we lived in that Albany area. He worked in New York, and that's how I ended up in Cambridge, because Cambridge was a rural area closer enough to Albany that my father could work in Albany, and if not come home every day, certainly come home every weekend and that kind of thing. So so that's how my life was. When I think about folks like the Oneidas who live in Wisconsin, for instance, who have been so far removed from their ancestral homelands, I come back to you, and I wonder, as a person within who works within the the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation. Talk to me a little bit about living a life that is so far removed from your ancestral homelands. And I know you said you guys do maintain an office in Stockbridge, Mass. I mean, how do you relate to your ancestral homeland when you have to do almost a land acknowledgement to where you're living now, that it's not essentially your own ancestral lands?
Yeah, so what an interesting time to bring up this question, because prior to 2 weeks ago, um, I would have told you I don't know what it's like. I grew up outside of Detroit, and only in the past 2 years moved here to Wisconsin to work with the community. And so even growing up, because my mom did grow up on the Stockbridge-Munsee Res here in Wisconsin, growing up, when we come on family vacation, we would come to Wisconsin. We would go to the res. When we would go to powwow, we would go to the Stockbridge-Munsee powwow. I think prior to being an adult, I'd only been to the Oneida powwow like once, and now I've gone, several times. So prior, to 2 weeks ago, I didn't know any different. 2 weeks ago, I had the advantage of making my very first trip to the homelands. Yeah, it was quite powerful. I was in the Berkshires for a week, so I was traveling between Williamstown and Great Barrington for a week, and then the second week I was technically on vacation, but I was up near Hudson, New York. So it was the best way to describe it is to tell you that I had never felt more of a sense of peace or more of a sense of being at home until I was there. And being surrounded by that, being surrounded by the Mohican, which is our name for the Hudson River, being surrounded by that, being surrounded by the Berkshire Mountains, and walking where my ancestors had walked, and remembering all those historical memories and what they went through so that I was able to do what I'm able to do today. It was very humbling, and it created more of a desire, of a fire to protect those areas, to be a part of those areas, to create more of a presence in those areas, for a lack of a more eloquent phrase, to make sure our history throws up all over that area so that people know when you are in the land of the Mohicans, and to understand what our ancestors went through. And so doing that work here in Wisconsin definitely has its challenges, but being out in the homelands, seeing what my ancestors saw, feeling what they feel. I know people say the land can speak to you, and I've only ever experienced that one other time in my life, until I was standing on the shores of the Mohican, and I could hear my ancestors and feel them and know that I was surrounded by them, and also getting confirmation that what I'm doing is what I'm supposed to be doing. And so it was a really powerful experience, and more than anything, I can't wait to go back out again. It's like 2 weeks wasn't enough. It was definitely a sense of being at home when I was out there. And I will say there was one interesting part of my trip when we got to where we were staying in New York, and we got off of the freeway and made a left turn, and there was a diner that had a big native mascot, full headdress, so not even the correct, not the correct any stuff. And I was just like, wow, like I couldn't. It was very interesting.
I want to thank Heather Bruegl for joining me on this episode of Let's Talk Native, and I look forward to teaming up again for this show and as we each address Native issues going forward. Thank you for checking out the show. As always, if you like what you hear, you can support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/letstalknative. You can follow the show on Twitter at Let's Talk Native. You can also follow us on Instagram at Let's Talk Native TV. You can also join our Facebook group page. I am John Kane, and this is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.
We are the tribe that they cannot see. We live on an industrial reservation. We are the Halluci Nation. We have been called the Indians. We have been called Native American. We have been called hostile. We have been called pagan. We have been called militant. We have been called many names. We are the Halluci Nation. We are the human beings. The callers of names cannot see us, but we can see them. We are the Halluci Nation. Our DNA is of earth and sky. Our DNA is of past and future. We are the Halluci Nation. We are the evolution, the continuation. The Halluci Nation. The Halluci Nation, the human beings, the people, see the spiritual in the natural through sense and feeling. Everything is related. All the things of earth and in the sky have spirit. Everything is sacred. Confronted by the ALie Nation, the subjects and the citizens see the material religions through trauma and numb. Nothing is related. All the things of the earth and in the sky have energy to be exploited. Even themselves, mining their spirits into souls sold. Into nothing is sacred, not even their self. The ALie Nation, ALie Nation.